They were already closed. The sign rattled in the wind as Richard spotted them. 12 young veterans stranded in the snow with nowhere to go. His failing diner had barely enough supplies left, but without hesitation, the retired colonel opened the door. The storm had swallowed the highway. From inside the diner, Richard could barely see the world beyond the glass. Snow whipped in furious sheets, blurring the neon glow of the old Colonel's Place sign until it flickered like a ghost in the dark. He tightened his cardigan around his shoulders, standing tall despite his 70 years, and wiped the counter one more time, out of habit more than need. Business had been dead all day. It wasn't just the storm, it was everything. The new commercial district 3 miles east, the dwindling traffic, the bills piling up faster than the snow outside. The clock behind the register ticked past 7. Time to close. Richard reached the door, ready to flip the open sign to close, when the sharp jingle of the bell stopped his hand midair. A man stumbled in, heavy coat dusted with snow, boots leaving wet prints on the worn floorboards. He pulled his hood back, revealing a weathered face not unlike those Richard had seen countless times in forward operating bases. "Evening," he said, his voice rough in the wind. "Any chance you're still serving?" "Highway's shut down about 15 miles back. Ain't no place open." Richard hesitated, glancing at the empty shelves behind him, the last pot of coffee sputtering low on the burner. His mind quickly assessed the situation. Limited resources, unknown duration, potential need. The same calculations he'd made hundreds of times in the field. Then he nodded. "Come on in. Warm yourself up." The man slid onto a stool at the counter, stamping his feet to shake off the cold. His name was Mike, he said. "Sergeant Michael Torres, 75th Ranger Regiment, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Richard's eyes softened. 20 years ago, he would have been one of the men under his command. In the kitchen, Maria wiped down the grill with the resignation of someone used to quiet nights. She'd been a combat medic before trading bandages for spatulas. She glanced at Richard, a silent question in her eyes. They had barely enough food left for tomorrow, much less for a room full of hungry veterans. Richard made a decision without speaking aloud. "Use what we've got," he said simply. "No one goes hungry tonight." Within minutes, the door jingled again and again. One after another, more veterans staggered in, tired, frozen, stranded. Young men and women with military haircuts and alert eyes, carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who'd served. Some wore veteran caps or jackets with unit patches. Others had nothing to mark them except the way they scanned the room upon entering, an old habit that never quite died. Richard's heart twisted. He recognized the look of soldiers needing a post, even temporarily. His gaze drifted to the gathering crowd, and for a moment, just a moment, there was a flicker of something familiar in his eyes. Something alive, something that hadn't been there in years. "Sir, we don't mean to impose," said a young woman, her frame slight but her posture unmistakably military. "Just need somewhere warm until the road's clear." "You're not imposing, soldier," Richard replied, the old authority slipping naturally into his voice. "We take care of our own here." And so the diner stayed open. Plates clattered, coffee brewed. The little space filled with the sounds of boots stomping warmed back into toes, of rough laughter cutting to the howl of wind, of war stories swapped like worn dollar bills. Richard moved among them with purpose, pouring coffee, offering what little food they had. For a few hours, it didn't matter that the diner was bleeding money. It didn't matter that the future outside those walls was cold and uncertain. Inside, for the night, they were a unit again. Maria worked the kitchen, stretching their meager supplies. She caught Richard's eye across the room and nodded once. Steady sure, though they both knew the pantry was nearly bare. Before all the dust and broken dreams, Colonel Richard Hartman was a name whispered with reverence across forward operating bases in 2 wars. They called him Desert Eagle. Not because he was the fastest or the loudest, but because when sandstorms swallowed convoys and enemy fire rained down, it was Colonel Hartman's steady voice over the radio that guided men home. "Hold position at checkpoint 4. I'm sending extraction. No one gets left behind." That was Richard. The battlefield was his church. Leadership is calling. The endless mission stitched the years together in a rhythm he knew better than the beat of his own heart. His men respected him not for bravado, but for his uncanny ability to remain calm in chaos. When others saw only danger, Richard saw patterns, solutions, ways through. In the midst of an ambush outside Fallujah, he'd calmly directed 3 squads to safety, while calling in air support with such precision that his entire unit emerged unscathed. The citation for his Silver Star mentioned his extraordinary tactical judgment, but what his men remembered was his promise: "I will bring you home." Those days shaped him. The weight of responsibility, the Brotherhood forged in fire. He never spoke of the cost. Sleepless nights, the faces of the few he couldn't save, the constant vigilance that became as natural as breathing. Richard's retirement wasn't by choice. A roadside IED on his final tour left him with a permanent limp and damage to his left ear. The physical injuries healed, mostly, but the man who led with quiet confidence, who saw purpose in every horizon, he struggled to find his footing in civilian life. He wandered for a while, restless, until one morning, he poured his coffee, set it down on a battered kitchen table, and decided if he couldn't lead men into battle anymore, perhaps he could create a haven for those who returned from it. That afternoon, he signed a lease for a crumbling old diner just off Route 40. It smelled like dust and old grease, but to Richard, it smelled like mission. Colonel's Place, open with little fanfare, and even less money. But soon word spread. Veterans started coming. Coffee steamed behind the counter. Stories swapped hands like currency. Unit patches and photos filled the walls. It wasn't the life he had before, but it was a life, and it was enough, until the road moved east. The storm outside clawed at the diner windows. Inside, Richard moved between tables with a slight limp, his back still military straight despite his years. Maria worked in the kitchen, making miracles from scraps. The room hummed with conversation, the kind that only happens when soldiers gather, a shorthand of shared experiences, gallows humor that civilians rarely understand. Mike sat at the counter, warming his hands around a chipped mug, telling stories that made the men around him chuckle, low and tired. Richard listened as he worked, offering coffee refills, his movements efficient as always. Then one of the veterans, a man with a beard frosted white with snow, squinted across the diner. "Wait," he said, pointing a thick finger at Richard. "Ain't you Colonel Hartman? Desert Eagle?" The room quieted. Heads turned. Richard froze, startled. The bearded man laughed, a deep rumble that shook the icicles off the moment. "Yeah, you are Colonel Richard Hartman, 3rd Battalion. You pulled our platoon out of that death trap in Kandahar, 2005. I'd know that voice anywhere." Murmurs rippled through the room. Another voice. "You were at FOB Eagle too?" "Hell, sir, your call sign saved my ass during that sandstorm. We thought we were goners until you talked us through." "Desert Eagle," someone whispered, the old nickname moving to the room like a current. Richard, who hadn't heard that name in years, smiled, a real smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You boys sure have better memories than I do," he said, voice rough but warm. Laughter rose like smoke from the tables. Stories spilled out. Tales of impossible extractions, firefights where Richard's tactical calls had been the difference between life and death, moments of kindness that had mattered more than medals. Maria stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Richard come alive in front of her eyes. She didn't say anything, didn't trust herself to. Instead, she turned back to the stove, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her chef's coat, and let the moment fill the room like a second sunrise. They weren't just stranded travelers anymore. They were his men, and he was their colonel again. The night wasn't done testing them yet. A sudden shudder rattled the diner, and the heaters groaned once, then fell silent. The cold rushed in like a living thing, seeping through cracks in the old building's bones. "Damn it," Richard muttered, military precision immediately kicking in. "Maria, get the emergency blankets from storage. Mike, any chance you know something about heating systems?" Mike was already moving, his boots squeaking on the wet floor as he knelt by the old furnace. 7 years as a combat engineer, sir. Give me a minute." He disappeared behind the utility door, toolbox in hand. Richard turned to assess their other situation. The food was almost gone. The supplies in the kitchen would barely last another hour. He caught Maria's wary glance from across the room and nodded once. Steady? Sure, though inside, he felt the weight of command pressing down. These people were counting on him again, and failure wasn't an option. 10 minutes later, Mike reemerged, smudged with grease and snow melt, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Patched it up best I could, sir," he said, flashing a tired grin. "She'll hold for now. Fan motor shot to hell, but I bypassed it. We'll have heat, just not circulation." Relief loosened something in Richard's chest. Not a victory, but a reprieve. Still, there was the food. When the last of their provisions was scraped out of the pan, Richard disappeared into the tiny apartment behind the diner. He dug through his personal pantry with cold fingers, grabbing cans of stew, packets of military MREs he'd kept for emergencies, and his personal coffee reserves. He carried it all back into the diner without a word, just set it down by the stove and got to work. The veterans noticed. None of them said anything, but their faces softened, their voices grew quieter, more reverent. Some things you don't repay with money. You repay with respect. That night, nobody left. They pulled together tables, pushed benches against walls, spread out jackets and blankets like makeshift barracks. Richard found a few extra quilts stashed in the supply closet and handed them out with the same methodical care he once used distributing equipment before missions. Mike tuned the old radio by the counter, found a scratchy station playing country songs from another lifetime. A young Marine with tattoos covering his arms carefully helped an elderly couple, both Vietnam-era veterans who'd been caught in the storm, to the most comfortable booth. Richard moved among them, checking on each person, a commander making his rounds. His limp was more pronounced as the night wore on, but his back never bent. His voice never wavered. He'd been trained to lead men through worse than a snowstorm, and old instincts die hard. At one point, a young veteran, barely old enough to have seen combat, sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. "Colonel," he said hesitantly, "how did you do it? When you came home." Richard paused, studying the young man's face, seeing it the same lost expression he'd faced in his own mirror for years. "One day at a time, son," he said finally. "Found a new mission. We're all still soldiers, just fighting different battles now." Around midnight, someone started singing, an old military cadence that rippled around the room, voices joining in one by one until the diner thrummed with it. Richard watched from his place by the counter, something powerful and bittersweet filling his chest. Maria slipped up beside him, arms folded across her chest. "Look at them," she murmured. "This is what they needed, what you needed too, for a few precious hours. The storm outside might as well not have existed." The diner, worn and weary as it was, had become a forward operating base again, a place where lost soldiers could find each other and ride out the night together. Because in war and in peace, there are no strangers in uniform, only fellow warriors. And that night, the storm could howl all it wanted. Inside Colonel's place, the fire kept burning. 2 days after the storm, the diner sat in silence again. The snow outside had settled into thick, frozen drifts. The roads were mostly clear now, traffic flowing along the new commercial district far to the east, a steady hum that never touched their little corner anymore. Inside, Richard wiped down the counter in slow, thoughtful circles, a damp cloth dragging across the worn wood. Maria swept near the front door, the broom scratching softly against the tiles, her mind elsewhere, on the bills they still couldn't pay, on the for sale sign leaning awkwardly against the fence out back. The night of the blizzard felt like a dream now, something too warm, too bright to have survived the cold light of morning. The coffee pot sputtered half-heartedly. The clock ticked. The world moved on. And then a sound, low at first, a rumble like distant thunder on dry land. Richard paused, dish towel still in his hand. Maria looked up sharply from the floor. Years of combat had taught them both to recognize the approach of vehicles. The rumble grew louder, closer, until it became a series of heavy, unmistakable sounds. Engines, not one or two, but many. The sound of brakes hissing, of doors slamming, of boots on pavement. Maria dropped the broom and moved to the window. Outside, beyond the frosted glass, one vehicle appeared, then another, not just cars, but military trucks, motorcycles with veteran group insignias, SUVs with service branch stickers. Within minutes, the parking lot was full, a sea of vehicles stretching down the side road, glinting under the pale winter sun like a convoy come home. The front door swung open, and there stood Mike, still bundled against the cold, a crooked grin on his face. "Hope you got more coffee ready, Colonel," he said, voice carrying across the silent diner. Behind him, veterans piled out of their vehicles. Men and women Richard had never met. Some he recognized from the storm night. Other strangers drawn by a call passed hand to hand across veteran networks. Mike pulled a folded envelope from inside his jacket and handed it to Richard. "We pass a word around," he said. "Veterans, active duty, support groups. Even a few folks from your old battalion chipped in." Richard stared at the envelope, thick and heavy with hope he hadn't dared to ask for. "It's enough," Mike added, his voice softer now. "Enough to clear the bank. Keep the lights on. Start over if you want to." 1 year later, Colonel's place was alive again. The parking lot overflowed with vehicles from all corners of the country, veterans of conflicts spanning decades. Inside, the diner buzzed, boots stomping, coffee pouring, laughter bouncing off the old wood beams like it had never left. On the far wall, where once had been only faded paint, now hung dozens of framed photographs. Young faces in desert camouflage, older men standing at Vietnam memorials, women in flight suits beside helicopters, group shots of units with arms thrown around shoulders. Between them, unit patches, medals in shadow boxes, and in the center, Richard's own silver star and command photo. The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a waypoint, a debriefing zone, a place where the newly discharged could find mentors and the long-retired could share wisdom. Richard had hired 5 veterans as staff, including Maria, who now ran the kitchen with military precision. Every Tuesday, they hosted job fairs for transitioning service members. On Thursdays, a VA council used the back room for support groups. The community had rallied around them, recognizing something essential in what Colonel's place provided, not just meals, but mission, purpose, belonging. Richard still wiped down the counter each night, his movements deliberate as ever. His hair had grown whiter, but his posture remained ramrod straight, his eyes clear and focused. He no longer felt adrift. He'd found his final deployment, not in some distant battlefield, but here, creating a forward operating base for warriors finding their way home. "I heard this place is kind of legendary," a young soldier said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. Richard chuckled softly. "First coffee's on the house," he said. "And so's a story, if you're staying long enough to hear one. Our veterans carry values worth remembering: honor, sacrifice, and unwavering support for their brothers and sisters in arms. Have you encountered someone whose service made a difference in your life? Share your story with respect in the comments below. Some heroes wear uniforms, others wear their courage silently.